Hello, my name is Adam House, and welcome to week 5 of my undergraduate student diary in college course of Resisting Fascism and Global History. This week I'm going to be talking about a few different things than we've covered in previous weeks, and then focusing in on one case study that was covered in class this week. Again, what I'm doing is I'm making a video for each week. I have a 3-hour once a week class. It's a 3,000 level college course in the history department called Resisting Fascism and Global History. And this student diary is just about me kind of reflecting upon class and upon the readings that I've done in the past week and any other, media that I've taken in, documentaries, movies, articles, and etc. So this class is reading intensive, and there's also quite a bit of other media that we're taking in for it. I want to mention at the same time that it's kind of been almost providential, kind of the way that my classes worked out this semester, because at the same time I'm taking other classes that kind of dovetail really well with this class and this subject. One of the other classes that I'm taking this semester is 20th century European history, which of course covers the time period that fascism came about and rose, and the most famous fascist regimes that we know of from history existed kind of in the early mid 1900s. So I'm also taking in the sociology department, I'm also taking a social movements class this semester, which does cover several individual social movements throughout history, but it's really more of a theory class. So I'm learning about social movement theory and talking about the different theories and how we study social movements from a scientific perspective. In other words, it's a social science class that's focused on theory about how movements are born and how they evolve and so on. So all of these things playing together kind of makes my Resisting Fascism in History class even better. I think illuminates some of the material a little further for me. Also, you can tell by the gray in my beard that I am a non-traditional student, and I have been a autodidact of history and political science and sociology. Basically, so the social sciences have been an interest to me pretty much all of my life. It's kind of been a hobby. I enjoy history. I'm a history buff and so on. So anyway, let's get into this today. Before we get into the case study that I want to talk about, I want to mention from weeks 1 and 2, we talked a lot about how to define fascism and the fact that fascism is kind of difficult to define. Even the academics who have studied fascism for decades tend to have differing ideas about how to define fascism. And I don't know if I mentioned before, there's an old author from American history named Sinclair Lewis who once said that when fascism comes to America, it will be wrapped in a flag and carrying a cross. So I think that's a direct quote. If not, you can look it up. I'm at least paraphrasing it pretty darn close to the actual original quote. Also from American history, there's another author named Upton Sinclair who once said that fascism is defined as capitalism plus murder. So there's a couple of other takes for you on how we might define fascism. All right, so let me go ahead and get into some other notes here. So the first the first one is a couple of things that stood out to me in the materials and in class this week. Was that in 1939 through 1941, this is the height of the Third Reich in Nazi Germany, and it's also, it's kind of the height of fascism in Europe is during this time. Obviously Germany not being the only fascist regime in power at the time. You at least can include Benito Mussolini's Italy and Francisco Franco's Falange in Spain, and then there were other dictatorships that arose over this general time period as well. So, but it's interesting to me that in 1939 through 1941, we've learned that resistors to fascism were not necessarily popular at the time. It was not something that was looked at as necessarily heroic. It was not, if you stood up to the Nazis during their rise to power, it was not necessarily considered an act of bravery or a righteous thing to do, or a moral or especially ethical thing to do. There was just, especially in Germany, it was not really considered a virtue to stand up to, in general, obviously if there's resistors, there are people who believe that for whatever reason, that their actions, their anti-fascist resistance to the Nazi regime was warranted. So, but the point here is that during the height of fascism, while it was rising and while it was at its height, up until just about until the days when it looked like, everybody started to figure out that Germany is probably about to lose this war. And, Italy and Germany and the other fascist movements were kind of losing steam. Up until that point, resistance to fascism just was not popular. So, if we want to study history from that old classical standpoint of we want to learn about it so as not to repeat it, we want to learn the lessons from the past so we don't make them again, then one thing to keep in mind is that if and or when you think or you do see fascism on the rise in any given country, state, whatever, movement, whatever it might be, that whether or not you feel resistance is warranted doesn't necessarily mean that other people are going to feel the same. And if you are moved, or if someone else is moved to action to resist fascism, it's not necessarily going to be popular. And you, in the early days of resistance to fascism, you may very well be seen as more of a troublemaker. You may very well be seen as more of a problem, that you're contributing to the problem than you are actually doing something productive or helpful or constructive. So, something to keep in mind, you're not always going to be given a hero's welcome for doing the right thing. And any of my fellow military veterans, if you spend any amount of time in the military, and especially if you've kind of been through, the whole process of being deployed and becoming a combat veteran and all that, then you probably already kind of know that. You've probably already kind of learned that lesson, that life lesson, and earned that wisdom somewhere along the way. So anyway, another lesson from history about resistance to fascism is that when the Allies and the rest of the world did begin to kind of figure out that they were probably going to ultimately win the war against Nazi Germany. Now, this would be, the days after D-Day. After D-Day, the landing of the Allies on the beaches and invading and pushing the German forces back into Germany and towards Berlin. Ultimately, obviously we know the history. The German Empire, the Nazi regime did fall. Adolf Hitler ended up committing suicide in his bunker, surrounded by some of his sycophants. And up until his dying day, he was upset at the German people because he thought that they had not done a good enough job of standing up and fighting to the last man to defeat the Allies and to preserve the Third Reich. So, but you're talking around 1943, definitely by about 1944, the Allies and really a lot of the Axis forces as well, and the rest of the world are beginning to figure out that, hey, it's only a matter of time at this point. The Third Reich is losing ground all the time, and it's only going to be a matter of time until this is over. Some historians making the point that Adolf Hitler really was a madman, and one of the historical markers that really brings out the fact that Hitler was delusional, that he really was a madman, that he really was crazy. He was so delusional in his own egotistical, megalomaniacal power that they say he probably carried the war on for at least a year or more longer than he really should have, or he really needed to, or like a year longer than any kind of level-headed assessment of any military leader would say warrants that we should continue fighting. You've reached a point where it's obvious that you are going to lose. There's no doubt about it. You're at the point where you cannot win this war anymore. And the only thing that you're going to accomplish by dragging it out is more terror, more destruction, more death, more murder, more bloodshed, more pain, more suffering for everybody. And so for Hitler to carry on the war for the last year or more that he did there at the end really is a telltale sign of just how absolutely insane that he was, and how morally bankrupt he was to allow this to continue, knowing that the only foreseeable outcome was loss. So anyway, another lesson from history is that during this time period, when everybody knew that the Germans were about to lose, the coalition of allies against the Axis powers began some infighting. So they were fighting with each other. And this was because they knew that the Third Reich was about to fall, and that, of course, to the victors go the spoils. So they're looking ahead as to, okay, well, when this is over, now how are we going to divvy things up? How is everything going to fall out? Who gets what? Who gets to say what happens? Who gets to claim certain, geographical land borders? Who gets to draw those lines? Who gets to say who goes where, and who gets to say what kind of governments that these countries are going to have after they come out from under the rule of the Third Reich. And so, people are beginning to jockey for position because everybody, of course, wants to be in the best position after the war is over. And so that causes some infighting amongst the Allied powers and people just in general who were resisting fascism, who were resisting Nazism in the Third Reich. And so, again, this is something that we can learn from resistance in the past. It is very important that if you have a fascist movement, that you're able to unite and ally a lot of different people against it. So, in other words, the idea being that all different types of political persuasions and people from different political ideologies and backgrounds need to lay aside differences in order to unite together against the common enemy of fascism. And that being the case, that obviously leaves a lot of room for disagreement among those allies. And of course, case in point, maybe the most obvious example is that after the World War II was over, you get the Cold War. The America and Russia, or the Soviet Union, were major allies throughout World War II. And after World War II, of course, you get the Cold War between the Soviet bloc and the Western bloc, basically America against USSR. So again, the lesson there being, if you want to defeat fascism, you need to be able to lay aside your other differences with people from other ideologies and political persuasions and political parties and so on. You've got to be able to lay aside those differences and have those debates another day. And I do say debates as opposed to fights, because these don't necessarily have to be fights. These can be debates. And hopefully that would be everyone's goal, would be to find civil discourse and to engage in the civic process, as opposed to violence, political violence, war, and all that. So lay aside the differences and refrain from engaging in infighting with your fellow anti-fascist resistors. So, what other notes do I have here right now? Okay, so let's get into this case study. This case study, and I'm not going to talk a lot about this because this was really more of a focus for us in class. We read an article. Let me pull it up here. This is an article written by Andrew Curry, last name Curry, Curry, written in, I believe, September of 2011, or at least published in September of 2011, by Andrew Curry, entitled "The Heydrich Equation." And I don't want to get too far off into the weeds here, because it's very easy to start getting into the details and kind of get off on a lot of tangents. So basically, the nutshell is that there was a Nazi officer by the name of Reinhard Heydrich. He was part of the SS under Heinrich Himmler during the Third Reich. Reinhard Heydrich was considered probably the top deputy of Heinrich Himmler. Himmler even had opined that Reinhard Heydrich was his right-hand man. He even said that Heydrich was his Genghis Khan, and he meant that as a compliment. Reinhard Heydrich had a reputation for one thing, for being kind of a quintessential Nazi. The Nazis were looking for the Übermensch, the Superman, and so they were looking for the ideal Nazi was somebody who would be tall and strong and handsome, blonde hair, blue eyes, lily white skin, and extremely intelligent and disciplined and all of the things that we might think of as being like quintessential masculinity, and kind of just the best of everything. As I said, the Superman, the Ubermensch, and Reinhard Heydrich kind of fit the bill. He's not an ugly guy, and he does, he is kind of a dashing character, handsome fellow with all the Aryan features that the Nazis wanted somebody to have. But he was also very disciplined. He was intelligent, but most of all, what the officers, the people above him, seemed to appreciate and like the most about him was that he was utterly ruthless. And we see his fingerprints kind of all over a lot of different, some of the worst atrocities and events that happened during the Nazi regime. One of those being the Night of the Long Knives. This is when a lot of the internal opposition to Hitler's inner circle was purged from the Nazi movement, and Heydrich's fingerprints are all over that. Also, Kristallnacht, which was when the Nazis went into the streets and attacked Jews and their businesses. They smashed their windows and tore up their stores. And if you were Jewish, it was a really bad time to be alive in Germany or any country in which Germany had a lot of influence, because Kristallnacht was really ugly, and it was kind of a landmark event in the Nazi regime bringing down the hammer on Jews. And Heydrich's fingerprints are all over that as well. So now in early, let me make sure I've got my dates right here. 1942. Yeah, okay, so in January, I believe it was January or early, at least in early 1942, Heydrich was one of the Nazi elite that met and was part of the meeting. In fact, he was a main character in the meeting where the final solution was finalized, and the Nazi regime decided that they were going to carry out a genocide of the Jews. They were going to, en masse, on an industrial scale, they were going to, by train, cart as many Jews as they could into these concentration camps, into these death camps, and exterminate them on, like I said, an industrial scale. And so Reinhard Heydrich was one of the main architects of that, and signed off on that, and helped to perpetuate and facilitate that. So this is only a few months later now, when we get to the event that I want to talk about here, the event that was the case study we were researching this last week. A couple of resistors from another country were flown into the Czech area, which is in Prague, which was an area that Reinhard Heydrich had been given management of. He was overseeing it. He was what they called the protectorate of the area. And so these clandestine guerrilla resistors were flown in behind enemy lines. They parachuted in, and they were planning to assassinate Reinhard Heydrich. And so for a period of time, they were making their plans. They were doing their reconnaissance, gathering information on Heydrich's, his movements, his lifestyle, his routines, where he lived, where he worked, how he traveled. And so they identified that his house and his office were under too much security, so they were not able to do anything at those locations. But Heydrich had a bit of a pride about him, and he also wanted to make sure that he never seemed weak and that he never made other Nazis look weak, that he didn't want the Nazi regime or the officers to look weak. And so he refused to travel with a security escort of armored vehicles. And so he basically just had a driver that would drive him around in a convertible Mercedes vehicle, and left him kind of open to the general public as he would go between like home and work and wherever else he would go. A lot of times he traveled without a proper security escort. And so that left him vulnerable, and these clandestine resistors identified the fact that this was a weakness and a vulnerability, and they took advantage of it. They made plans to assassinate Heydrich, and they did. So they picked a day and a time, and they jumped out from their place where they were kind of waiting along the route where they knew Heydrich was coming, being driven around in this open-top Mercedes. And they jumped out in front of the car, and one person tried to shoot Heydrich, and the gun jammed, and it gave Heydrich a moment to draw his weapon and begin to return fire. And then one of the other resistors threw a homemade explosive device, and instead of it landing where he wanted it to inside the car, it kind of hit the side of the car and exploded there by the tire, and wasn't at the time they didn't think that it had been very effective. Now this becomes chaos and confusion. You've got Nazis chasing these would-be assassins, and in the confusion, Heydrich kind of stumbles back to his car, falls over the hood, and one of the, I believe it might have been his driver or one of the other Nazis that was there, soldier or someone, identified the fact that Heydrich was bleeding, that he was bleeding out. And so Heydrich told them, don't worry about me. Go get the perpetrators. Go get the assassins. And so they chased down the assassins. Well, it turns out that the homemade explosive device that had exploded next to the car actually did create some shrapnel, and part of the shrapnel had gone into Heydrich's body and pierced his stomach, and he had internal organ injuries, and internal bleeding, and he ended up dying a slow and painful death over the course of several days, and ultimately he did die. Now it took quite a while, but after several more days, the assassins were tracked down. They got away initially, but eventually they were all tracked down, and they were, another whole story into how they ended up getting tracked down and how they died. Ultimately, they ended up in a standoff, hiding in a church, being hidden by some priests, actually, or at least some men of the cloth. And in this standoff, they did keep the Germans at bay for a while, but eventually, as the Germans kind of broke through the barriers and came into the area where they were hiding in the church, the anti-fascist resistors committed suicide kind of like at the last second. So if you want to see, first of all, this article is really good. The Heydrich Equation by Andrew Curry, again published in September 2011. I think it's definitely worth the read. It's a fairly short read, and it's well written. So if you want to see a Hollywood rendering of this story, there's a movie called Anthropoid. Um, Somewhere around 2011, 2014, I think, somewhere in that time period, that this movie Anthropoid was made. And according to historians, the Anthropoid motion picture is actually pretty accurate. It's supposed to be relatively accurate. So maybe a good one you might want to check out. So now the question is, was it worth it? And apparently a lot of historians still argue as to whether this assassination was worth it, because even leading up to the assassination, some of the Czech people, the few resistors that knew about the plot to kill Heydrich, there were some of them that were against it. And they had already seen a lot of reprisals against the Czech people, and they had seen the brutality of Heydrich and people like him, Nazis like him, the SS, the Gestapo, and they kind of anticipated that if Heydrich were to be successfully assassinated, that there would be major reprisal. There would be a lot of bloodshed, and it would be on a large scale, and it would be brutal, it would be ugly. And they anticipated that, and therefore some of them were against it. Others felt that it was important that the assassination should go forward because, for whatever reason, maybe they believed that Heydrich was an especially evil guy, or an especially brutal guy, or an especially powerful and kind of one of Himmler's as well as one of Hitler's favorites. And so to take out Heydrich would be seen as a major blow to the Third Reich and its kind of aura of invincibility. To land a blow against a prominent officer like Heydrich would have been, and it was, kind of unprecedented, as no one to that point had been able to take out like a major key officer within the highest ranks of the Third Reich. So it was seen as an important symbolic victory to kill Heydrich. But what ended up happening then after Heydrich was killed was that there was reprisal. There was major reprisal, and the city of Lidice, and let me pull this up. The city of Lidice was razed by the Germans after this assassination. Lidice was in what's now the Czech Republic. It was not necessarily a Jewish town. When the Nazis would commit these atrocities against the Jews, unfortunately there was a lot of anti-Semitism all around the world at the time. And so it was not necessarily a good public relations strategy to talk about the atrocities that the Germans committed against the Jews, because as sickening actually as it is to say, a lot of people just didn't care, or they were minimally concerned with that. So the fact that the town of Lidice was not primarily Jewish meant that it could, it could garner a lot more sympathy for the people of Lidice when it was publicized what the Nazis did there. And so the reason that the Nazis chose Lidice was tenuous at best. It had been mentioned in a letter from somebody who was not one of the assassins, but was just writing to a girlfriend and said, hey, I've got to go on the run and I can't be with you anymore. And basically, he was just trying to break up with his girlfriend and give some bullshit excuse. But that was enough for the Nazis. They didn't care. Whether there was an actual connection or not, they just said, okay, one of the assassins is somehow tied to a family in Lidice. So what we're going to go do is, and what they did do was go to, and it was a mining town, a poor mining town in the Czech countryside. And they went to the town, and everybody over the age of 15, men and women, everybody over the age of 15 was executed. The whole town. The children, there were a lot of children. Again, you could read the article off the top of my head. I want to say there were 80 or 90 some odd children. A few of those children were relocated into German families so that they could be Germanized or Nazified and get a proper Nazi raising, upbringing, and all of the rest of the children were shipped to a concentration camp and put into gas chambers and exterminated. The Germans then used all different types of weapons and explosives and destroyed every building in Lidice. Every house, every building, every structure, completely, totally razed to the ground. And so it was destroyed. The whole thing was burned out, and Lidice, for all intents and purposes, was wiped off the face of the earth. This was the reprisal for assassinating Heydrich, and it was only one of many other events that happened as a result, as part of the reprisal process. So again, historians sometimes will now ask, and apparently even the professional academics that have been at this for decades, a lot just don't agree. There are people who believe that it was worth it in the long run. People who believe that it was not worth it, and then a lot of other people that believe, that they're on the fence. They can't really say definitively one way or the other whether they think it was a justified action or not. I have my own thoughts about it. Personally, I'm on the fence about it, but I can totally see, especially after our class discussion about this, I can totally see both sides. Of those people that say, yes, definitely it was worth it. Those people who say, no, it really wasn't. I can see both arguments there. And like I say, I don't really come down on either side. Of course, we have the luxury of looking back on this as an historical event, and we're able to look at what happened afterwards, the consequences of this, how things played out afterwards. And we have that luxury of kind of looking back on it with 2020. And I imagine for the people who were there in the situation at the time, the way that they would have looked at it and made their decisions would have been much different. So it's just difficult for me to say what I really think was the right course of action there. So free to learn more, research more about this on your own, make up your own mind what you think about it. So almost ready to wrap this up here. I didn't mean to talk so long this time, but here we go. So one of the questions that I asked was, how would things have likely played out differently if Heydrich were not assassinated? So this is one of the thought exercises that we can engage in. If he hadn't died, what would have been different? What would have changed? Did that one death actually change anything in the grand scheme of things? Did it do more harm than good in the long run? And some of the people that say he should not have been assassinated will point to all of the reprisals, but then people who say that he was justifiably assassinated will say, well, but the reprisals are the Nazis' fault too. Yeah, I mean, you might have anticipated that there would be reprisals, but you don't blame the victims for the reprisal. It's still the Nazis that are the bad guys. So, anyway, there's a lot of different ways that you can look at this. And so there was a discussion about the idea, and I've heard this phrased in different ways. One of the phrasings that I like best is from an old saying that violence only begets more violence. So there's a cycle of violence. If there's a tit for tat, you've got two sides of something, and there's a tit for tat, then it just continues as a vicious cycle, and you have to ask eventually, where is the off ramp? Or do you just continue to let the cycle escalate and grow and grow and grow? And if you never find a way to end the cycle of violence, it only continues to exponentially get worse. So of course, this situation that we're talking about with Reinhard Heydrich, there was already a war going on. There was already, they were already in the middle of a world war, which included many individual wars, even civil wars, and different factions that were fighting in different countries, in the same countries. So there was just a lot of violence and chaos at the time. And to kind of pluck out any one violent act or violent event that happened during the Second World War is kind of problematic in its own, because there is the wider context to consider. So one of the thoughts that I'd had about this was that, in general, I don't agree with political violence. I do think political violence is a mistake. Political violence, especially things like assassinations, really only tend to play into the authoritarian's hands in the long run. Because typically what political violence is going to do is it is going to solicit a reaction from the other side. And if you're talking about an authoritarian government like the fascist regime of the Nazi Empire, then you can expect reprisals, and you can expect it to be broad and brutal, and kind of disproportionate, if you want to put it in those terms. So political violence gives an authoritarian regime an excuse to become more authoritarian, to engage in an ever increasing police state, and to rule with an iron fist. And so the cycle of political violence, while sometimes it may be justifiable depending on any given individual scenario, general rule of thumb, it's just not a good idea. Even if it is, morally somehow justifiable, it may not be the best strategy. It does tend to play into the cycle of violence just escalating. And when you let that Pandora out of the box, it's really difficult to put it back in. Because, especially I think people who engage in pro-Civil War rhetoric are ignorant and or evil, because a civil war is never something that you want. Nobody wins a civil war. In a civil war, everybody just loses. Now, some people are going to lose more than others, but everybody's going to lose. Everybody's going to suffer. Everybody's going to feel pain. Everybody's going to regret it. Everybody's going to wish that it had never happened. And in the long run, it may be that some people lose more than others, but you can't really say that anybody wins a civil war. Nobody wins a civil war. So civil war should never be something that anybody wants or is trying to bring about or trying to propagate in any way. If you find yourself engaged in a civil war, that means there has been a total and utter failure and that failure has probably come from both sides that fight in that civil war. So, with that said, I think that most people would also agree that using violence in self-defense is justifiable. This is we use this in a court of law. Sometimes people have to defend themselves from an aggressor, from an assailant, from a violent actor. And if you employ violence to defend yourself, then we call that self-defense in a court of law, and therefore you may not even have charges brought against you if it's obvious. Somebody breaks into your house, they have a weapon, they threaten you, maybe they even hurt you, but you pull out your home self-defense weapon and you shoot them, you kill them, or wound them in the process. You stop them somehow from hurting you or hurting your family or whoever it is. You may not even have charges brought against you because we would consider that a justifiable employment of defense, of violence in self-defense. You could say the same for, other innocent, weak, vulnerable people, babies, and, weaker people who are being attacked. If you intervene to help someone who's being bullied, who's being hurt by another person, unjustifiably attacked, if you intervene in that to help a person who's being attacked, then we would call that justifiable. You're employing violence because you're trying to defend an innocent person from being attacked by another violent person. So anyway, let's see. So I think ultimately political violence has to be evaluated on a case-by-case basis. And again, the general rule of thumb being that you really want to try to avoid violence. So I would say just in general, just as a general idea here, let's put it in the hypothetical context of a political movement. If there's a fascist movement that is rising within a country, or a government that is becoming fascist, an authoritarian regime taking power, the first option should not be, therefore we need to use political violence. We need to move towards a civil war. We need to have a civil war to overthrow the regime. That should not be your first action. That should not be your first aim. That should not be your goal or even your thought, your purpose at all. Quite to the contrary. In fact, if I hear somebody saying that we need to employ political violence, then generally my first rebuttal or rebuttal somewhere along the way is going to be, hey, before we talk about political violence, what have you done that's not violent? How have you resisted in other ways? Have you used your voice? Have you voted with your pocketbook? Have you used boycotts? Have you used sit-ins? Have you used civil disobedience? Have you used strikes? General strikes. If a fascist regime tries to come to power, or it does come to power, then maybe the best course of action is not to take up arms against that regime, but rather to engage in mass civil disobedience and other acts of resistance in a peaceful, nonviolent way. Resistance can be active and it can be assertive without being violent. So I hope everybody can take that away from today's diary entry. Active resistance can be active and it can be effective without being violent. Sit-ins, strikes, mass civil disobedience, sustained protest. These are things that can work against authoritarianism. All right, so one more thought here. People often contribute to the rise of fascism, not so much because they support it, but history teaches us that people can contribute to the rise of fascism because they fear another movement rising, historically a communist movement or some other type of leftist movement, the people within a country become so fearful of a communist movement or a socialist movement or some other kind of left-wing movement. They become so fearful of this that they will maybe even cooperate. Help might be a bit of a strong word, but at least cooperate with fascists, just because they see fascism in its early stages. They see it as less of a threat than they do a communist menace or some other type of authoritarian menace rising. So again, this is historically speaking, and I'm not going to get off into the weeds right now because this has already been too long of a video again. But the idea here being that a lot of times when we look at historical examples of where fascism has arisen, it has happened in a political situation where the environment was such that people were more concerned about communism or some kind of left-wing movement coming into power, and therefore, even if they didn't help the fascist movement come into power, they at least tried to remain too neutral or stay too quiet. And there's all kinds of reasons that people may do that, and I'm not even going to judge people for trying to stay out of the back and forth between the two political extremes. But again, it's just a lesson that we learn from history, is that often fascism rises because people perceive a left-wing authoritarian threat as being more of a threat, more of a danger than they do the right-wing authoritarian threat. And the right-wing authoritarians seize upon that. They use the silence and the passivity of the masses to seize power, because we all know that fascists are not shy to use political violence to seize power. And with that, this has been week 5 of my student diary in Resisting Fascism in Global History. Again, this is really not for you. This is more for me, processing and reflecting upon what I'm learning, trying to organize my thoughts. So if you don't watch my video, it doesn't hurt my feelings. But if you do watch and you get something out of it, all the better. So with that said, last thing to say here: fuck Trump, fuck ICE,